Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, my guest is Mark Lawry. He was a qualified solicitor and then switched to become a stay-at-home dad. For many years, he's been, in his own words, an active participant in depressive illness since he was in his teenage years, which sparked his interest in wanting to know more and understand everything that he possibly could about the subject. And he's now written a book which has the subtitle A Participant's Guide to Depressive Illness. So welcome to you, Mark.
Thanks for having me on.
Perhaps you can start by telling us about when you first started to experience symptoms, behaviour that you now know to be associated with depressive illness.
Yeah, I guess one of the key things on this is I didn't think of them as symptoms because, as for all of us, our own experience is normal to some extent, or at least we don't think about it as a symptom. And if we think we're struggling in ways that other people aren't, it's easy just to think that we're a bit rubbish or useless compared to other people, rather than thinking it as a symptom of a thing. So I can look back, as I have done with various mental health professionals over time, to when I was 14 anyway, when I would just have more or less out of nowhere episodes where I just sort of suddenly couldn't really cope with things that I'd been perfectly able to cope with in the weeks and months before. And looking back, I can see that was the start of depressive illness, which has then carried on erratically with episodes from time to time since.
And did you get? I know you're not dissimilar age to me. I mean, did you get help back? When you were a teenager, when you first, realised that there was something that was.
No, I mean, as I said, I really did just assume that I was just being a bit rubbish and a bit pathetic, and everyone else was managing to get on with everything, and I just wasn't. And I managed to maintain that view quite firmly right the way through working as a solicitor in the city, until I finally actually managed to seek some help when I was about 33. I was 33. And, that's one of the reasons, I guess, for why I think this podcast is great. It's, it's so easy not to seek help and to think it's some dreadful thing you've got to try to keep secret. There's this wonderful quote that depressive illness is this thing where you feel like you've got this terrible secret that you must keep from everybody, and you're not even really allowed to know what your secret is. Which is just, is a pretty horrible position to find yourself in. And I went to desperate efforts to keep going and not let anybody know what was going on for me. And I don't sound like I'm ashamed of this, but I am kind of ashamed of the fact that I was sort of proud of the fact I kept going. And I was proud of the fact that when I finally did seek help, nobody seemed to have any idea there was anything wrong, and I was sort of proud that I'd managed to hide it, which is obviously a ridiculous thing to be proud of. It's not healthy, it's not good. I think it's very easy to have this idea that seeking help is a kind of sign that you've reached the point where you really can't any longer cope. And of course, logically, it's the opposite of that. Seeking help is the most sensible way of coping if you need help. Not seeking help when you need help is not coping. That's not coping. And it took me till I was 33 to figure that one out. So that wasn't very bright.
So was there a particular tipping point or event that caused you to seek help?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things with whatever the causes are of people having depressive illness, that they're many and varied and enormous. And some people have an event that triggers them off. They probably have some sort of propensity towards depressive illness, but nonetheless, they're then triggered by something. I've never been, as far as I know, and you can never be quite sure, I've never been triggered by anything in particular. I just have these waves of depression that just come over me from time to time, and gaps in between them are unpredictable. And there's not really a particular obvious cause. I can carry on. I can be doing exactly the same things in the same circumstances that I was doing for the months before, and then just suddenly within the space of a week, I can go from basically fine to, I mean, very significantly not fine.
Can you perhaps elaborate or give examples of what that looks like? For people listening as well. What I know you when we've spoken before, you talked about things as simple as brushing your teeth.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's sort of it is a whole. It's a whole sort of assault on you as a being, as I'm sure many people listening to this will be aware. And it's sort of somebody whose book I like very much, Professor Wybrow, Mood Apart. It kind of divides the symptoms up into sort of three chunks, and one is low mood, which is perhaps what everybody might think, oh, that's what depression is. But it is so much more than that as well, and it's a whole series of things that become vicious circles that all feed off each other. And so classically, you don't sleep very well, which, and the problem with all of these things is once they start happening, it's not that you have a bad night's sleep. You carry on not sleeping very well for days and weeks and months. And that obviously makes you tired. And then what goes along with that is a sort of second whole category of symptoms that Professor Wybrow talks about, which are the sort of housekeeping symptoms of just your appetite and your whole looking after yourself, and you just haven't got the energy to look after yourself properly, and you don't want to look after yourself properly. And obviously that just makes things worse. But you just can't muster the energy. And as you say, I mentioned to you in the past, the point where I know things are going badly is where I'm in bed and the thought of having to brush my teeth is more than I can get my head around trying to achieve. And so I don't get out of bed. And I literally, it's just the thought that I would have to find the toothpaste and the brush and make one, put the toothpaste on the other and brush, and it's more than I can kind of muster the mental energy to think about.
You talked I know when we talked before, we talked about this concept of, and I might pronounce this wrong, of anhedonia. Tell us more about that, because I think that's an extension of what you're talking about now.
Yes, and I mean, I think, and it's not just me. Many people have suggested this is really actually the core of depressive illness, and it sounds very pretentious, anhedonia, but it's a Greek word, and an means not, and hedonia is the same root as hedonism. So it's very much not hedonism. It's not enjoying anything. It's not pleasure. Which it doesn't put like that. Maybe doesn't sound that bad, but it's literally in its sort of full form, an inability to find any pleasure in anything, any joy in anything, any enthusiasm for anything, and it just means, you don't look forward to, I like my food. You don't look forward to a meal, but also it actually, you become unable, or I do at least, become unable to experience the taste of food, or everything becomes this completely just flat thing with no hope. And sort of the absolute killer with it is you can so easily reach this point where you really can't imagine ever enjoying anything ever again. And I sort of get an idea of, for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, and I fear many people perhaps will, but it's literally the point where if someone came to you and said, I will pay for you to go anywhere and do anything you want in the world, my only thought would be, there's not anything I want to do. There's nothing I'm interested in. There's nothing I want to do. Can I just go back to bed forever, please? And so it's literally just an inability to even imagine. And also what it classically can do, and lots of people have written about this. Andrew Solomon, The Noonday Demon, I would really recommend to anybody. It's brilliantly written, and it has lots about the idea of anhedonia, and it's just you can reach the point where you can't even really believe that you enjoyed any of the things you did in the past. Even you can look back on your past and sort of think, yeah, but I probably didn't. I didn't really enjoy that thing that at the time I thought I was enjoying. and it can just, which, I mean, you can imagine how if you're feeling that for days and weeks on end, it does become a pretty grim place.
But this is, as you were saying, this is kind of cyclical, or it's it peaks and troughs.
Yeah, yes, no, quite. And I mean, I mean, to some extent, luckily, and there's people who have very different. Not everyone has cyclical depressive illness. I mean, I have been diagnosed as bipolar 2, which tends to be the cyclical kind of variety of depressive illness in reality, and it's different from bipolar 1, which is what used to be called manic depression, sometimes still is, where you have sort of psychotic experiences and hallucinations in your high bits and then really low downs. And it's not the same as that, but it tends to be the bipolar 2 that I've been diagnosed with is when you get it sort of cyclically for no particularly obvious reason, rather than for something happens in your life and you plummet into it.
And so so going back to, you were 33, and you got some help. What did that look like?
I mean, it was literally, and I mean, looking back on it, it was absurd, because I had been desperately struggling for 2 or 3 months, and just, stupidly trying to carry on. And I literally reached the point one Friday morning. This is 2005. I got out of bed and got my suit on. Physically, I was in such a bad way, and I hadn't slept and for months, and I was sick, actually physically sick, and still I was putting my tie on, and I was getting ready to go to work, and and it's just this sort of thing that's very easy for a lot of people to get into. I think just this feeling that you have to keep going, you have to keep it secret, otherwise there's going to be some slightly unknown but definitely catastrophic consequence if you don't keep going. I mean, I guess it perhaps I'm talking about my own circumstance, I guess, because I had gone through the effort of getting qualified as a solicitor, and I'd been a solicitor for 10 years, and it is quite easy to imagine in that circumstance that revealing that actually you're not coping like people think you are at all is going to be the end of your career, and that's a bad thing. So kept on trying to hide it. But on that Friday morning, I didn't have the physical energy to walk to the station. I mean, I actually really didn't, and that's what in a way that the mind and body are quite clever. If you really are stupid enough to just try and keep going forever, they will just stop you physically from doing it. And I went back to bed, and I lay in bed, and I thought, there's probably something wrong here. I probably should see a doctor. So I just saw my GP. She spoke to me for 2 minutes before saying that I was quite clearly clinically depressed. Slightly worryingly in some ways. She spoke to me for about another 5 before she prescribed antidepressants, Prozac, but which actually was, well, may have been the right thing, but it was a bit alarmingly quick. And so this was all on the Friday. I was still sufficiently in the mindset that no one could know about this, that I tried to go into work on the Monday. Even though she'd said to me, you're going to need some time off work. And I was like, no, I can't. I mean, I remember just saying, I can't, through a sort of blubbering, snotty mess that I was at the time. And I'm just looking at me, what you're going to have anyway. So it turned out Monday morning she was right. I was going to have some time off, because there was no way I was going in. And so I ended up being off work for 4 or 5 months. And I mean, I was lucky enough, and I feel that very strongly. I was lucky enough through my work to have private health insurance, so I got to see a psychiatrist within about 10 days. If you weren't lucky enough to have private health insurance now, you'd be waiting quite a long time, even in what was I was in a bad way. I needed some help. I mean, I've said it before. I've broken bones and things, and you get immediate urgent help inevitably at A&E, and I was much more in need of urgent help in October 2005 than I was with any of my broken bones. And you just wouldn't get it if you didn't quickly enough, if you weren't didn't have private health insurance. So I mean, I had slight guilt that I was lucky enough to be able to jump the queue and see a psychiatrist quickly, but I didn't need to. Everyone else needs to be able to as well, rather than me not. And yeah, so I saw a psychiatrist at the Priory in Roehampton, which was, I was initially completely shocked by. I'd vaguely heard of the Priory. As far as I knew, it was somewhere where celebs went to kind of check themselves in very glamorously, to be pampered, like it was a spa hotel, and were treated for drug addictions and things. And it was, it's not, funnily enough, it's a psychiatric hospital, where they have lots of psychiatrists and therapists and people to help people who really need help. And one thing I always I found interesting, just in conversations with quite a lot of the therapists, was just they pointed out that a lot of the celebs, they get a press release, it's some sort of addiction, because in their world that's fine and actually quite not glamorous, but quite normal. They then receive treatment for depressive illness, which does just, I think it shows the ongoing stigma that there is, that those people would much rather have it be known they've got a heroin addiction than that they're suffering from depressive illness. Now, one of those, to some extent at least, you've arguably brought on yourself. Now, I mean, there's all the stuff about how people who have addictive personalities, and perhaps they don't really bring on themselves, perhaps they, but to some extent they've brought it on themselves, maybe. But it's still much less shameful as far as people are concerned, saying they've been in the Priory being treated for depressive illness. It says a lot, I think.
And how much, and without asking for any specifics or details, there's also an assumption that perhaps it's based, depression is based on underlying trauma or something that happened to you, years ago in your childhood. How true is that, certainly in your experience, or can it just be the way that your brain is operating at the time?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've done quite a bit of therapy and thing over the years now, and I've thought about this, and therapists will inevitably inquire about your childhood and whether there was anything that you can think of. I've never been able to come up with anything, which doesn't completely mean there haven't been things that might have made me more likely to get depressive illness, conceivably, that I'm still just not really quite aware of, because, like I said earlier, I mean, your own normal is sort of normal. So perhaps there were things that I mean, as far as I know, mine would seem to be pretty much at the purely biological end of cause, and it really varies for everybody, I think, from the reading I've done. And there's there are people who will be absolute, probably, from what I've read, everyone is somewhere on a propensity to suffer from depressive illness, like so many things. So that for some people, it would need only something tiny to happen, or relatively tiny to happen, for them to suffer from depressive illness as a result. Other people are much more resilient in terms of their chances of experiencing depressive illness, and they will survive living in Ukraine and being bombed, and somehow extraordinarily will still manage not to have any depressive illness. And so then there's all sorts of social factors and things that which your life just being hard. I mean, my life, I often feel a bit guilty, well, quite guilty about this. My life has not been hard in any way. I've been a privileged person. I've had objectively a very easy life. And so there's no real, I've always struggled. I have no justification for my depressive illness, as it were. It just happens. So, yeah.
So it's on an individual basis, basically.
Yeah, no, quite. There's, it's what I think. Depressive illness. There's a whole load of different experiences of it. There's a whole load of different causes of it for each person. And yet at the same time, there's a huge amount of similarity of what people experience. Most people would experience some element of the anhedonia, of the not sleeping, of the loss of appetite, of the not being able to think clearly and not being able to concentrate and all those things. So it's sort of there's a definite, very coherent set of things that people tend to experience, but at the same time, everyone's unique. Everyone's experience is unique.
So so right at the beginning, we talked about the fact that you then decided to become a stay-at-home dad. Was that part of your coping strategy? Did it seem that the logical thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I had never exactly loved being a solicitor, and I didn't find it very satisfying. I was in intellectual property, so I spent a lot of my time writing letters on behalf of very big companies to smaller companies, moaning that a name they were using was a bit similar to my client's trademark. And I was sort of writing them and thinking, oh, but come on, who cares? I mean, really, can't we all just get over this? So I never exactly loved being a solicitor, and it's one of those classic things. I think, perhaps particularly in depressive illness, where it's very important to be clear that just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. I mean, I could be a solicitor, and that's sort of perceived as a good thing to do, and therefore it was very easy to feel like because I could do it, was capable of doing it, I should do it. Whereas actually, it was not doing me any good. And there's all sorts of things about being a solicitor that are not terribly healthy for someone who has any propensity to depressive illness. I mean, not least the fact that I used to have to record all my time in 6-minute units. So if you had a bad hour where you really were not feeling, and you just weren't concentrating and you couldn't concentrate no matter how hard you tried, you were not recording anything for that hour, and then that just built kind of pressure, and there's a number of reasons. Anyway, so I yes, it was it's one of the probably about the most interesting period of my life in many ways. I went from going to the Priory for the first time in November 2005, thinking, or at least up to that point, thinking, what I've got to do here is I've got to find a way to get back to being able to function as a city solicitor, and that's what I've got to do here. And within 3 or 4 months, it was okay. What I've got to do here is find a way of not being a solicitor anymore. And it just all the awareness of it just wasn't. It's not an ideal environment for anybody who has a propensity to depressive illness that comes back. My wife and I had previously thought about having children. My wife is also a city lawyer. We had kind of had conversations where we agreed it wasn't going to work for us both to be city lawyers when you can regularly still be in the office at 10 or 11 o'clock at night or whatever and have a child. We would be having to have a full-time nanny who actually looked after the children. So basically, this was my moment to seize my chance to get out of having to be a solicitor, and become stay-at-home dad. That's what happened. In the end, it all happened a little bit more abruptly than was the plan. For various reasons, my wife emerged from childbirth in a wheelchair with various broken bits, and so I became stay-at-home dad on day one at birth, which wasn't exactly the plan, but I did. And I mean, looking after it's really it's classic thing. I mean, well, I guess what I should say the relevant point of this podcast maybe is, and I have no idea why my episodes of depressive illness come on. I really don't. They just appear. I didn't have a bad one for the 10 years from that moment being stay-at-home dad. And obviously it just, I guess, looking after small children, it gives you plenty to do. It gives you a sense of purpose. It is a sense of purpose where it's your child, and it feels like worthwhile. For whatever reason, I didn't have an episode at all, a significant episode for that sort of 10-year period. And I mean, no one would glamorize being a stay-at-home parent. It has lots and lots of periods of tedium and frustration and boredom and whatever. But it worked much better for me than being a solicitor had.
And your children are still School age, are they? You're still...
Well, yeah. Well, the older one will be off to university next year, so no, I mean barely, barely. Yeah, but I mean, I have to say, you know, being a stay-at-home dad was interesting because I mean, I think there's since the time of COVID, when obviously a lot of fathers just ended up spending a lot more time at home and more time with their children, and have then gone on to spend more time in doing childcare. In 2007, there were still very few stay-at-home dads doing it full time, and this was a thing where I sort of got undeserved. It was sort of praise and congratulations. I mean, I remember regularly having conversations with mums, and they would sort of say in slightly amazed tone, "Oh, what, you look after them the whole time, and you feed them and you do all the nappies and whatever." And I'd sort of say, "Well, yeah," and they'd say, "Wow, that's amazing," and I'd say, "Yeah, it's exactly what you're doing. It's exactly what you're doing." It's like, and I would. It was a bonus. I would get more credit. I would get more credit for doing exactly what the mums were all doing.
Do you think it's changed now?
I don't really know. I think maybe a bit. I mean, I think there definitely are more dads doing more of the childcare, I think, even than were then. But yeah, no, I mean, it was just it sort of used to amuse me that and it was quite nice. I would get credit for doing all sorts of things which most of the time the people giving me the credit were doing the same thing exactly. It's like, oh, what you are up at 4:30 this morning, and then you're sort of with them all day. Yes, like you. It was very odd.
Let's talk a bit about the subconscious and the brain, because I know you've spent a lot of time researching and trying to understand, some of the complexities around, depressive illness, not least its name. I mean, perhaps we start by, do you want to talk about your thoughts on the name we give it? But then let's talk a bit about, the brain itself and what you've...
Well, it may have been noticed that somewhat tediously I've called it depressive illness. I think more almost every time, because I just think depression is such a feeble sort of a term for what is a very real thing for people who experience it, and is a very vicious and brutal thing for people who experience it. And some people sort of say, oh, they sort of object to other people saying that oh, that was depressing when I don't know, it rained when they planned a picnic or something, and they say, oh, that was depressing. And then there are some people in the depressive illness community, as it were, who sort of object to them saying that, and you shouldn't say that's depressing, because that's not really depressing. I think it's depression that needs to change its name. That's perfectly reasonable use of depressing, although I would prefer dispiriting myself. If people could just say it's a bit dispiriting that it rained when we were having a picnic. But so, and then you're into the options of what else you could call it. Depressive illness flags that it is an illness. It's better than clinically depressed, which I think is all. I think. I mean, that's what the GP initially said to me on day one of me seeking help was, "Oh, well, you're clinically depressed." That just sounds like you're miserable, but I, as a doctor, am willing to certify you as miserable. that's still how it sounds to me. So anyway, depressive illness, I think, is better. It acknowledges that it is. I mean, again, you could huge arguments about whether illness is right or whether it should be disorder or syndrome. And I mean, frankly, I don't care. It's doesn't matter what you call it. But depressive illness flags that it's a real thing, with the symptoms that people vaguely think of as depression. I would prefer, and I'll get on this will get me on to my rant about the brain being somewhat fundamental. I would prefer depressive brain malfunction, because that is actually a description of what must be going on. People will say disparagingly, "Oh, depression, depressive illness, that's just all in the mind." To which I sort of reply, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, it is. But that's what makes it so serious and so brutal. I mean, I don't know how other people think about it, but I kind of tend to think my mind is one of my most important things. And if it's all in the mind, that's quite serious. And then that in itself, then, well, what is the mind really? And I mean, people over centuries have argued about this, and they've come up with other explanations. to my simple way of thinking, the mind can only be something that emerges from the brain. I don't know where else it comes from. And people will talk about it as a sort of immaterial soul or all sorts of things people over the centuries have. I can't see how it doesn't come from the brain. So what we are talking about in depressive illness, like so many other, like epilepsy and Huntington's, all sorts of brain problems, is some sort of malfunction of the brain, because you reach the point your brain is clearly operating in a way which is not in your own best interests. It's removing all sense of enthusiasm or motivation from you. It's making you unable to think very rationally or to concentrate or to do anything. It tends to make you feel like you're completely useless and pathetic and worthless. So it's your brain it's your brain creating a mind definitely unhealthy. And so I've read a whole load of neuroscience books to try and see what anybody knows about what is going on in the brain of someone who ends up experiencing depressive illness. And there are things that people have discovered, but the overwhelming thing that people have discovered is that the brain is really complex, really, really complex. So that it at least is not surprising that nobody quite knows what's going on in the brain in people who suffer depressive illness. It would be amazing if people did understand it. And it doesn't mean it's not a real thing. It doesn't mean it's not a real thing that people are experiencing. The descriptions that people have given over centuries and centuries of all different parts of the world of a thing that is clearly depressive illness, and they're all remarkably similar. It's clearly a real thing. Just because we can't pin down what it is that's going on in the brain that's causing it doesn't make it any less real. There was an article in Nature just about 10 days ago, which just sums up how mind-bogglingly complicated the human brain is, and why it's really not surprising we don't understand it. A group of scientists managed to analyze cubic millimeter of mouse brain. And in that cubic millimeter of mouse brain, which is smaller than a grain of sand, they found that there were 500 million connections, synapses, neural connections, and that the total wiring within that piece of brain in a mouse, smaller than a grain of sand, there were over 5 kilometers of wiring. Now, if you think that the human brain is that much more complex, and then you think of the whole human brain, it's reckoned that there's something like somewhere between 100 trillion and a quadrillion connections in a human brain, which, again, one of my favorite stats about just how just to get a feel for what that really means. If you were to count one of those connections each second, it would take you somewhere around 3 to 30 million years to count them all. And so anyway, just the point is, just the brain is an incredibly complicated thing. Depressive illness must emerge in some way from the brain, but it's not that surprising that we don't know exactly how, because it's going to be a long while until we are able to actually map a full map of the human connections. And I think people get sort of quite excited about MRIs that can sort of flag up areas of the brain that are doing stuff when people are asked to do things, and when they're in an MRI machine. But that's nowhere near telling us what's going on at an individual neuron or synapse kind of level.
Is there a lot of that is beyond the realms of comprehension in terms of those scales and the magnitude. Is there anything? I know we talked a little about this a bit earlier, but is there anything from what you've researched that might indicate that some people perhaps more susceptible, or are there themes, attributes that some people might have which would mean their propensity for depressive brain malfunction is more than others?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, there's been lots of studies done, and the most sort of telling with all of these sort of things to try and find out whether there's a hereditary or a genetic link is people have done lots of studies with twins who've either been brought up together or in rare circumstances, but does obviously happen, particularly on adoption, identical twins who are brought up separately. So identical twins have fundamentally exactly the same genetic makeup. And the studies have shown that if one twin has demonstrated depressive illness symptoms, the other twin, even brought up somewhere entirely separately by different parents, is that much more likely to also experience depressive illness symptoms. So there is definitely a hereditary genetic element. And they've started finding gene variants that do increase propensity to depressive illness, but unfortunately they've only found ones that increase it by sort of 0.5%, or so nothing that's particularly conclusive. But there is, there's no doubt about it. Different people are more likely to suffer than others.
And in your experience, I wanted to ask you about this. There's often a lot of discussion around drugs to help with depressive illness versus not using drugs, which might be masking or hiding what might be the cause. In your experience and through your research, what are your kind of findings on that?
Yeah, well, I'll do my experience, which was, I kind of look upon the drugs as worth a try. So I have taken Prozac for very nearly 20 years, and I'm also on lithium, which is sort of a medication that's given largely for bipolar disorder. I've taken that for about 20 years, so I've been taking them for ages. I can honestly say I've got no idea whether they help or not, which is not very helpful. But there's no way of knowing. I mean, would I have had more episodes of depression if I hadn't been taking those medications? No idea. I mean, I have had serious episodes whilst taking the medication. Does that mean they're not working? I honestly don't know. And I'm afraid that from my research that the results are not that much more conclusive on general population either. How much they help. I mean, antidepressants, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, of which Prozac is one, there seems to be quite good evidence that they help people with quite severe depressive illness, not so much people with milder depressive illness. I mean, that slightly is one thing that interests me, and I think is worth knowing. I mean, me with my easy, privileged, pampered life, if I'm managing to feel despair and worthlessness, there's probably something medical, biological wrong going on. But if you are a single mother who lives on the 17th floor of a block of flats and the lift doesn't work and you've got 3 children and you're finding each day an incredible struggle and you're not experiencing much joy or enthusiasm for anything, you might still have depressive illness, but you might just, have a really tough and hard and unpleasant life. And the problem is there's a lot of people in that situation who go and see their GP because they are finding it really tough, inevitably, and GPs will just give them a prescription for an antidepressant because that's all they've got to offer. They can't move them to a nice house on the ground floor, and it's not within their power. So all they can do to show they're taking the person seriously is offer them antidepressant, and that sort of skews all of the tests then of whether antidepressants work on depression, on depressive illness, because there's an awful lot of antidepressants probably being given to people who aren't actually suffering from depressive illness. They need other help in their lives urgently, but not depressive illness help.
So apart from the medication that you take, how, perhaps you could just explain how, what is your coping method, on an ongoing basis? I mean, you looked after your children for, 10 years, and you said that really reduced the amount of episodes that you might have experienced. But what, for people listening as well, I know there's no answer, but what's your strategy?
I mean, I wish I could honestly say I really have one. I mean, I guess my strategy is not. I mean, I haven't had paid employment since 2005, which I guess is one of my strategies in reality, because I know that there will be times when I won't be able to cope with doing stuff if I have to. So I do. I mean, it's partly in reality while I wrote the book. I mean, that took up whilst the boys were still at primary school anyway. My time from dropping them at 9 to picking them up at 3 p.m. I spent reading over 150 odd books on all sorts of subjects, and then writing my book. And obviously the advantage of that is if I had a period where I was feeling a bit mentally wobbly, I could just not really do that, and no one minded it. It didn't matter, and I could just take it easy whenever I wanted or needed to. So I mean, I guess that again, I'm very fortunate. I don't have to work, and so I do various volunteering things where I can basically do as much or as little as I want to do or feel I can do at any time. So I mean, I'm afraid I have no kind of magic answer to anyone who has to earn a living and things. But I mean, I guess it is the point. If you're feeling you're struggling, get some help, talk to somebody. And I mean, I get one of my coping mechanisms, I guess, is whenever I have felt on any kind of slippery slope, I have tended to see a therapist. And I mean, I find that incredibly helpful. I mean, I have to, if anyone had told me this in 2005, when I went off the first time to see a psychiatrist, and he actually suggested I do some therapy, and that was the most terrifying part of the whole experience. I think it was just like, oh God, no, I don't need to do therapy. Surely I'm not mad. I'm not, and there's a lot of, it's really easy to sort of mystify therapy. It's basically just talking to someone who's a hopefully experienced and trained person at listening to people, in circumstances where you can say anything confidentially, so you can just let it all out. And I mean, I do think therapy only works if you do kind of adopt that approach. If you're still if you're censoring yourself in therapy, you're probably not getting the full benefit. And just talk things through. And I mean, it does help. It helps me enormously, or has done at times.
So I think I was going to ask you a final question, actually, which I think you've kind of really answered. But for people listening, who perhaps are your what happened to you is resonating with them. What would your advice be? In terms of a first step, just to at least make some sort of forward motion.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, it does depend on circumstances, and I don't know. I'm quite in a position to advise other people, but and depending on how bad you're feeling. But if you're feeling like this is, I'm struggling to cope, I'm not looking forward to things, I'm not sleeping, and all those things, and you think this, do seek some help would be my advice. Don't be an idiot like I was for so long. Seek some help. Seeking help is coping. You're not acknowledging that you can no longer cope. You are coping by going to seek some help, and whoever that might be. I mean, if you've got that friend who you really can talk to, that's fine. If you've got a partner, talk to your partner. But I mean, an independent person, just GP start with, and then if you can get some therapy, or I think that's it is really helpful. It's amazing how useful it is just to better talk things out rather than keeping them going round and round in your head, getting progressively worse and less helpful.
And I guess you said earlier, that you thought it was just you, and that but I guess that normalization of
Yes.
it's not just...
Yeah. No, quite. Yes. Just to become aware that you're really not the only one, and read other people's accounts. There's lots of really good other people's accounts, and I think of them as thank God, not just me moments. And you're reading a book, and someone describes something which is a thing that you've thought or felt or done or anything. Well, I may be mad, but there's someone else who's mad in exactly the same way, at least, and that's reassuring in itself. So, yeah, the normalization is really important. It's just to realize it's not just you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for being really open and honest with us. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you can relate to Mark's experience and don't know what to do next, we recommend that you speak to your GP or a health professional. To help raise the profile of the podcast, I'd be very grateful if you could leave a rating or a review on your preferred listening platform or directly on the website, mid-lifemen.com. Finally, there's a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, which is based on the podcast and available on Amazon and through other online retailers.